the young Victoria comes to the throne and an unknown scientist is experimenting with a fantastic new power, electricity. Expecting crystals, he discovered something quite different. Mites apparently growing on his equipment. The news breaks that he's creating life. And for a God-fearing nation, that's a Gothic horror story. Were these new scientists meddling with nature? Playing God?
Today, we live in a world dominated by science and technology. But for the Victorians, much of what we take for granted was new, exciting, and sometimes even frightening.
This is Fine Court, tucked away in the Quantock Hills near Bridgewater in Somerset. 150 years ago, it was the home of a brilliant but misunderstood gentleman scientist called Andrew Cross.
Cross was an enthusiastic amateur who worked at home with no desire for recognition, but he would become notorious as the man who was Frankenstein. Cross's laboratory would have been packed with the tools of his trade, weird and wonderful equipment. Strangest of all was the machine to generate a fantastical new power, electricity.
This is actually a Wimshurst machine, named after the man who invented it, James Wimshurst. Let me show you how it works. In here, there are 3 pairs of glass discs. And when I turn the handle at the end, they rotate, each pair going in opposite directions. Look at this. And you'll see that touching against the discs, there are little wire brushes like this one here, and just underneath the wire brush, there's a comb, metal spikes almost touching the disc. Now, as the discs go round, they generate charge, and the charge is picked up by the metal comb, brought along these wires into these. These are called Leyden jars, and they're capacitors. They store charge, and they gradually store it up as I turn the handle. And if I can generate enough, then I'll be able to get sparks between these 2 brass balls at the end. Now, I'll move them about an inch apart, and if I can get a spark to jump that inch, it'll be 100,000 volts. Let's see what I can do. Cross reckoned that to get his machine up to full charge needed 230 turns. I hope this one will be a bit more efficient.
Cross's experiments caused a sensation. The local villagers were afraid to come up to the house, terrified that the Thunder and Lightning Man, as he was known, was entertaining dancing devils. It's no wonder the villagers were concerned about the strange goings-on at Fine Court. For most Victorians, science was new and mysterious, the stuff of horror stories.
Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, The Invisible Man, and Dracula. These books were sensationally popular with the Victorians. And they all starred a new breed of hero, the scientist, desperately battling with forces beyond his control. And they also asked a really scary question: where would it all end? Were these men just studying nature, or were they trying to control it? In other words, were they playing God?
One of Cross's experiments was especially disturbing to a God-fearing public. Trying to grow crystals, he discovered instead tiny white mites, apparently growing on his equipment. And even today, the presence of these Akari can't be explained.
Unfortunately, it was picked up by the Times and other newspapers, who said that he'd claimed to have created life, which was quite untrue. He'd never claimed any such thing. In fact, he utterly denied it. But the story was out. He said, "Opinion to me is but a wind, experiment a rock." But unfortunately, they'd published the story, and his reputation was ruined.
Cross paid the price for science rubbing up against religion. To the Victorians, the idea of a man creating life was not only frightening, it was blasphemous, and Cross was condemned as a dangerous heretic, a godless monster. He took refuge hidden away in his lab and died a bitter man. The early Victorians were people of unquestioning faith. For them, the Bible was God's literal truth and the backbone of everything they understood to be true. But science had a different way of looking at the world. Cross may not have created life, but other scientists were discovering new evidence that was every bit as shocking.
Just look at these fabulous fossils. They were popular collector's items for the Victorians, but to many they were merely curiosities because they didn't fit into the generally held worldview set out in the Bible that God's earth was only 6,000 years old. However, there was a growing argument that these fossils were part of an altogether different story.
Lyme Regis on the Dorset coast was a fossil hotspot during Victorian times. As fossil hunter Colin Dawes knows, it still is today, for all the same reasons.
Yeah, what's happening is a lot of rainwater is pouring through, seeping through that shale.
Right.
That's hardened Jurassic mud.
Right.
And then the shale's getting top hard heavy and sliding over the layers of limestone. That's the mud that contains the fossils, so does the limestone. And as it comes down with these cliff falls, we're picking up fossils as we go along.
So in fact, all this rain we've had in the last 6 months is really good for you fossil hunters.
It's absolutely superb.
As the fossils rained down, Lyme became a battleground. Scientific discovery versus religious dogma. For geologists, fossils were evidence of an ancient world predating biblical history. And there was plenty of evidence to be found. There still is. You can't walk down the beach without stepping through a fossilised graveyard.
That's a big one.
That's an excellent one.
Is it? Good.
It is indeed.
And so this is the body here then?
That's right, the body, the guts, the vital organs of the creature would have occupied this space past the last war there. It would have gone round and then, I'd say about here. So it's quite a big shell, isn't it?
It is a big beast, yes.
And out of here would poke the head and the tentacles.
Tentacles?
That's it. It had
Really?
the head of an octopus. It's
right.
It's an extinct relative of the modern octopus.
What did the Victorians think about these things?
The story was that St Hilda, as abbey, her abbey was plagued with snakes. She didn't like this, and so she turned them to stone, threw them over the cliffs and they turned to stone.
Oh, wonderful.
At first, it was easy to explain these fossils away with stories of saints and mythical beasts.
That's a beautiful specimen, full of white calcite crystals.
Many even thought they were put there by God to test the faithful.
So, what have you found, Colin?
It looks like we've got an ichthyosaur vertebrae.
It's well
Yes,
stuck
it
in.
is a vertebrate.
Is
You've
it?
got one. You've got one.
Wow,
Yeah, that's
look at
smashing,
that.
isn't it? He's nice.
But the evidence was mounting against them.
So this is all the stuff you found this morning?
Most of it, yes, we found it today on the beaches.
That's amazing.
Very nice.
Now, this huge thing, is that a bit of ammonite?
That's a part of the outer coil of a rather large ammonite, perhaps a foot in diameter.
Right, that's a
And
very
lovely.
substantial piece, isn't it?
Nice. The best find we've had today, I
Right.
think, is this one. And that you
That's
can
very
see,
pretty,
look at the
isn't it?
pattern on there,
That's absolutely wonderful. It looks like a tyre tread to me.
doesn't it?
It was looking more and more certain that these curiosities were in fact the remains of prehistoric creatures preserved in the layers of rock. If so, there were some big questions to be answered. If the world was billions of years old, not thousands, how was it formed?
Scientists were becoming convinced that the Earth must in fact have been formed by ongoing natural processes. It couldn't have been created in 6 days or designed by one hand. This had serious implications for the Victorian belief system. If things on Earth needed a rethink, what about heaven? What about the afterlife? Could science provide answers to questions like these?
The new technology of photography claimed direct evidence of the spirit world. Much excitement was generated by ghost photos. Photographs like these fueled a growing craze for spiritualism, which had spread from America in 1848.
Okay, if you'd like to come on in.
Spiritualism swept through Britain, existing in a strangely comfortable harmony with church-going and promising absolute proof of the afterlife. The faithful became vulnerable to tricksters who offered the hope of speaking to spirits.
People having their beliefs, their religious beliefs, undermined by scientific discoveries, and they desperately wanted to continue to believe in life after death. And the seances seemed to provide that scientific evidence they were looking for.
We're going to recreate a Victorian séance. Our medium, Richard Wiseman, is a parapsychologist who has investigated how Victorian mediums thrilled their customers.
One of the reasons why I've been asked to stage the séance here is that this house has a reputation for being haunted by this woman here, Ida Hudson. What we're going to do is try and get in contact with Ida. Now, if everyone can just hold hands. Superb. Just relax. And welcome to the séance.
In the pitch dark, the séance is about to receive a visitation, but not from Ida.
Enjoy the experience.
It's Richard's sidekick, Matt, who's been hiding in a cupboard.
And open out your hearts to Ida.
Only we can see him, thanks to an infrared camera.
Spirit coming back.
A series of Victorian props on the table are marked with luminous paint, and it's these that will create the illusion of a ghostly presence.
Let's think about the maraca. Imagine Ida moving the maraca. Okay, everyone stay with it. Imagine, that's great. Okay, that's good. I want you to concentrate on the ball. Imagine the ball becoming light and moving. That's good. That's good. Stay with it. Stay with it as a group as we open up our minds, open up our hearts to Ida. Imagine her reaching back after over 130 years, being with us. Excellent. Excellent. That's good.
Victorian mediums use techniques just like this to hoodwink the believers.
Imagine Ida gently fading away. Everything's going to be fine.
The responses of everyone around the table are actually quite phenomenal. There we had a group of people who just simply saw a maraca move across the table and a ball float into the air, and totally convinced that yes, indeed, there was some paranormal force, some sort of spiritual force at work. So it's amazing that these techniques, which over 100 years old, are still fooling people today.
The Victorians were desperate to believe in the afterlife. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid and influenza swept the cities, killing indiscriminately. Churchyards became full and a crisis was looming. Where could the new dead be buried? Eventually, Parliament responded to the demand for grave space. Bodies were sent out to new super cemeteries. At London's Waterloo, there was even a special train to take the dead and mourners away from the city.
4 returns, 1 single, please.
It was called the Necropolis Railway, and it still goes direct to Brookwood Cemetery, a huge 58-acre municipal burial ground in Surrey. Amidst all this funereal traffic, there were dark stories of what might befall an unfortunate Victorian. terrifying tales of premature burial were circulated and of scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lids.
To guard against the possibility of this fate worse than death, enterprising inventors saw an opportunity and patented a range of bizarre devices.
If you were lucky enough to wake up before you were actually buried, you could use this special coffin lid patented in 1843 by Christian Eisenbrandt of Baltimore. You can operate it from inside.
It's spring-loaded, and all I have to do to let it up is pull this string and release the catch. Here's another invention, perhaps slightly less well thought out, patented in 1899 by Monsieur Nicole in France. There's a glass window here. He realised that if you woke up inside your coffin, you might find it a bit stuffy, and he thought what you needed was air. So this glass window could be broken by a hammer here at the touch of a button. The only problem is that when the hammer comes over, if you're lying inside, you get a face full of glass and then a hammer in the nose. Anyway, I reckon it's very dangerous. I've got my safety specs on. Just watch this. Wow. In 1900, Walter McKnight of Buffalo, New York, patented an all-electric device for indicating the awakening of persons buried alive. Now just imagine I'm 6 foot down, buried and alive. This tube comes all the way up to the surface, and here is the surface of the ground, and this box sits on top. And inside, there's all this gubbins, and when I press the button down there underground, look what happens. So if there are loads of people waiting to be disinterred, you couldn't miss them.
For those lucky enough to be dead when they were buried, there was another horror to face before eternal rest could be achieved. The Resurrection Men.
Dr. Robert Knox, the famous accomplice of body snatchers Burke and Hare, is buried here at Brookwood. Knox used to buy fresh corpses at so much a foot, with a special price for smalls. These corpses were used to teach anatomy to students, and the whole business caused a public outcry until new legislation put an end to grave robbing.
Medical students and surgeons-to-be learned not only from dissection of corpses, but also from operations on live patients.
You have to imagine an audience of 150 students leaning on all these rails, peering in, and it's quite creepy down here in the middle. It feels like being on a stage of a theatre. In fact, of course, it is a theatre, an operating theatre. They used to do the operations in St Thomas's on the wards, but the screams of the victims were so disturbing to the other patients that they built this place specially in the roof of the old church. Now, Stuart, I believe you're going to do something very unpleasant to me, is that right?
That's right. Well, the procedure we're going to look at today is an amputation, a very common operation in the mid-19th century because of the dangers of gangrene spreading through the body. Yeah?
OK, so you're going to take off my leg, yes?
That's right, yeah.
Whereabouts?
Below the knee.
Below the knee.
Below the knee.
Right, good.
Now, I should point out that the operations in this theatre would have taken place without any form of anaesthetic at all.
No anaesthetic?
No anaesthetic at all. So the patient would be fully conscious throughout the operation. So it was important that the operation was quick. And it was a common piece of surgical showmanship to get the medical students in the stands to time each procedure. So we'll begin. Basically, this is a straight back amputation knife, and it would be used to remove all the skin and muscle. Now, the procedure was called the tour de maître, the turn of the master. The knife would be brought up under the knee and then would be brought straight through all the flesh and muscle, totally severing all the flesh. Yeah? That would be done in not much more than a few seconds. And then a straightforward surgical saw would be used to go through the two bones, and the leg would be removed.
Gosh, it sounds awful. Now, I don't want to be rude or anything, but your apron doesn't look terribly clean to me.
It wouldn't be, and in fact the surgeons at the time operated in their day clothes, frock coats or whatever.
You have washed your hands, have you?
I would probably wash them after the operation more than I'd bother to wash them beforehand, considering the fact that if you've got a wound, it is likely to be full of pus, so I wouldn't really see the necessity to wash my hands before treating the patient.
How many people died on the operating table?
This operation we've just looked at, about 25% of the patients would probably succumb eventually to hospital infection. And there were many sources of infection in a hospital, and one of the most obvious ones is that the medical students assisting in the operation, the surgeon himself, may at some point during that day have been dissecting corpses. So it was very easy for infection to spread.
In 1867, Joseph Lister transformed surgical practice overnight with antiseptics.
Lister's technique was so simple that at first most surgeons refused to believe it could possibly work. But it was tremendously effective, and it quickly brought about a revolution in surgery. He used carbolic acid because it had been so effective in disinfecting the sewers. Now, this is carbolic acid, otherwise known as phenol, and this spray is one of the first carbolic acid sprays ever used in London. It's so precious that I'm not allowed to touch it. But you fired it up underneath, and eventually the carbolic acid came spraying out of this nozzle. To begin with, he just sprayed the air, which must have been horrid because it's filthy stuff, it's acidic, and you can't breathe, and it tastes terrible. But then he realised that it wasn't just the air, it was also the instruments and the hands of the surgeon that needed to be made antiseptic before they started to operate.
Since Lister, the whole theatre has become a sterile environment.
Just look at these all-metal instruments, designed to be sterilised. They've hardly changed since Victorian times. And the familiar surgical gloves, another Victorian idea, from 1876. But one innovation that was really popular with the patients was anaesthesia. In 1846, chloroform was introduced to this country. That was good news and bad news. Good news for the patient because it meant you were asleep when you were being cut up. Bad news because things sometimes went wrong. And in this very hospital in 1849, a chap called John Shorter was having a toenail extracted when they gave him too much, and he died. The thing is that anaesthesia was a bit of a black art. They had no idea how it worked, and the only way they could find out was by trial and error. And all the time the patient was hovering between life and death. Such a patient was revived by an amazing experiment in Germany in 1871. The patient was almost dead, and a scientist, Herr Steiner, applied a weak electrical voltage directly to the heart, which started beating again. Now, early experiments like that were the forerunners of modern defibrillation.
Stand clear. Discharging.
Shocking. How Frankenstein was that?
Scientists were starting to make a difference. But it wasn't just the inside of hospitals that needed cleaning up, it was whole cities. Victorian streets were quite simply filthy.
On Oxford Street and Regent Street alone, 24 tons of excrement were washed off the streets every single day. And that was just what the horses and mules were producing. The human waste was estimated to be 15 million cubic feet every single day. Cesspits and open sewers just trickling into the river. Just imagine what the smell must have been like.
Urban Victorians thought that the foul smells of the city were directly responsible for the disease and death they experienced all around them. They believed that the air itself was bad.
Life was constantly under threat from terrifying invisible forces. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, influenza. They connected these diseases with the horrible, insanitary, overcrowded conditions of their cities. But unfortunately, they blamed the smelly air itself.
However, here in London's Soho, one scientist was getting closer to the invisible truth. His work made him an immediate local celebrity. There's even a pub named after him.
In 1854, John Snow, a doctor who practiced in Frith Street, just a couple of hundred yards away, made a study of an outbreak of cholera. Now, cholera was a particularly disgusting disease. You got awful diarrhea, and if you were unlucky, you died in a couple of days. And there was a huge outbreak right here in Soho on his doorstep. Nobody knew how it was spread, but he had a hunch and was determined to prove it. So he drew a map and showed where each case had come up.
It all started on the 31st of August. Just 3 days later, 127 people had died. John Snow recorded them all on his map.
47 people died here in Berwick Street.
Within a week, 3/4 of the residents had fled, abandoning their homes. Shops were left shuttered and the streets were empty.
16 people died here in Carnaby Street. And 39 here in Marshall Street. And a staggering 97 died right here in Broad Street, now known as Broadwick Street.
Over 600 people had died in just 1 month, and the cases all clustered round Broad Street. But one group of people who didn't drink water all survived.
There were 70 workers in the brewery right here in Broad Street, and not one of them got the cholera. And actually that wasn't surprising, because they drank beer, and the source of all the trouble was this, the water pump, where everyone else was drinking from. It turned out that the well was 28 feet deep, and 22 feet down it was being contaminated by a leaking sewer. John Snow got the handle taken off the pump and stopped the outbreak dead in its tracks. He worked the whole thing out in a brilliant piece of detective work and founded a new science, epidemiology.
Some scientific ideas were clearly beneficial, but others were just too radical to accept.
One of the most misunderstood, misrepresented and maligned scientists of the whole of the 19th century was Charles Darwin. But the fact that today he's regarded as one of the great thinkers of all time tells us an awful lot about the way the role of science changed during the Victorian era.
Darwin's theory of evolution was the most controversial of the century.
In 1859, Darwin published his famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. We're so used to evolution that it's hard to realise what a shock it was to the Victorians. They thought that we had been placed here in God's image to rule all the other creatures on Earth. And Darwin was saying it wasn't like that at all, that we were just upright apes that got lucky, formed by an ongoing process of evolution. It was earth-shattering.
Scientists like Darwin were true visionaries of their time. Their scientific discoveries brought about a revolution. By the end of Victoria's reign, scientists, once vilified, were celebrated, and institutions like the Natural History Museum in London had been built as cathedrals to a new religion.
But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these ideas was the enormous mind shift they created. It wasn't just that they challenged existing religion, they created something new and suggested that to find the truth, you needed not faith, but science.
When you think of science, you think of expensive laboratories and advanced equipment, but really, you can do very important science with basic equipment.
What do I do? How do you do it? I think I'm blowing mine up bigger than yours.
Very responsive, that.
Peeing in a pot, a bit unconventional, but to Darwin it made perfect scientific sense.
What Darwin found came down to very careful thought and these simple experiments.
The genius of evolution.
Darwin's Garden, coming soon on BBC Two.
Newsnight now on BBC Two with Gavin Esler.
The deputy leader of the